everybody. My name is Liz Kukka. I'm the executive director at Ethereum Classic Labs. We are an accelerator, an investor, the core development team for Ethereum Classic, and we also provide grants and research funding for a variety of different things. So on the accelerator and investment side, we work with teams that integrate with ETC, who build on ETC. We also invest in Ethereum-based projects. And on the grant side and research side, for grants, it's for teams that integrate with Ethereum Classic, and for research, it's really blockchain agnostic. So that would include anything like stateless channels or scaling solutions. The ETC core dev team, they're a distributed team that work with us. They're based mostly in the United States, Canada, and Eastern Europe. And that was supposed to be up while I was talking. So, so just to give you another overview of what was just mentioned. So the purpose of the talk today is on multifaceted enterprise solutions. We'll get into interoperability a bit at the end. So if that's the main thing that you want to hear about, perhaps take a nap for the next 15 minutes and perk up again at that point. So I'm going to cover 3 different aspects: enterprise requirements and usually what they're looking for in blockchain solutions, then go into different use cases that are a bit of a hybrid model of public and private, and then conclude with adoption, which is the interoperability piece. So, for enterprise requirements, For enterprise requirements, most of the next few slides are going to come from a 2019 global Deloitte blockchain survey that was done with 1,300 executives across the globe. And it'll also come from my experience working at Plug and Play Tech Center, which has been the bulk of my experience working with corporates and startups. So that's going to be the bulk of kind of the next handful of slides. So what you're going to see above me right here is that enterprise seem to be taking blockchain more seriously and are kind of taking it from this like kind of tourism space to actual execution, which is great news for everybody in the room, I assume. These companies here, they weren't listed in that survey, but we can assume that these are companies that they're referring to, because those that were surveyed were organizations with $500 million in revenue or above from the US, or $100 million and above outside of the US. All of these corporations here are working or either experimenting with blockchain now or doing some kind of integration. And so I think this is a pretty good representative of the types of enterprises that were included in that survey. Some of the great news for folks in the room and who are developing solutions for enterprise is that over 40% are looking to deploy $5 million or more this coming year, and that's in new blockchain initiatives. So it's excellent news for anyone who's trying to work with enterprise. The second is that over 50% of those corporates have listed blockchain as a critical aspect of their strategy for the coming year. So that's also great news. However, on the downside, we do see that enterprise are also starting to view blockchain solutions as overhyped. And we also see less integrations happening in 2019 than compared to 2018. And so when we take a step back and ask ourselves, like, why is this? What's going on? We know that there's an increase in investment or an interest in investment. It's mission critical, but then at the same time, why aren't corporates integrating as much, and why are they starting to think of it as overhyped? And so this comparison to this image here is from 3D printing from 6 years ago, and comparing the state of blockchain today to 3D printing. So 6 years ago, people were thinking of 3D printing as kind of like this fun hobbyist thing that wasn't going to take off. But 6 years later, we see that manufacturers are using it pretty intensively to improve cycle times, to improve manufacturing, to improve kind of the life cycle of design. And so we're kind of seeing or comparing blockchain to 3D printing of 6 years ago, and that's the state of it. So my recommendation with kind of concluding in the enterprise segment of this presentation is what can we do to keep enterprise interested and excited to work with all of us when it comes to blockchain solutions. So to start with, it's like, who are you talking to at the organization? Again, formerly being at Plug and Play Tech Center, blockchain is a horizontal, it's not a vertical, right? So it can be implemented in fintech or supply chain or retail or farming or agriculture, whatever vertical that may have you. Most of the startups that I worked with over the past several years oftentimes talk to the innovation team. Innovation team is probably one of the easier teams to talk to, and when comparing them to, say, like venture capital, they're kind of like scouts. They're the team that's working on behalf of all of the other departments, trying to scout and find solutions that they can bring into the organization that they don't have to build themselves internally. So if you see up here, the innovation department is not usually the team that's giving you the funding, not usually. However, it doesn't mean to ignore the innovation department, because they will probably be your cheerleader. They'll probably be the ones to help you get into the right department, that will speak on your behalf and cheerlead for your company to the right department. What you are going to see is that the IT department and usually upper level management are still the ones that are going to be the key decision maker when bringing your technology into the organization. In that Deloitte survey that I had referred to at the beginning, there are a handful of questions that were recommended to these senior executives when thinking about blockchain. There are around 10 questions total. These next 4, the ones that I kind of picked out that I thought were most interesting, these first 2 are really about customer empathy. So when you're working with enterprise and you're trying to understand your customer, these are 2 questions that I think are pretty key to ask, which is, how can blockchain reshape their industry? And for most blockchain startups that I work with, again, it's a horizontal, so they might not come from supply chain or healthcare or ed tech or anything else, and you're trying to go into an industry that you don't know that well. So how can you get to know your customer a bit better, understand the pain points that they're very familiar with for the past 10, 15, and 20 years to really get them to adopt or be interested in what you're doing? And the second one is the potential for new market ecosystems and the role that your customer would play in that. And so again, having customer empathy, and so that they actually feel like you understand their pain points. The next 2 questions are a bit more visionary. So when working with enterprise, helping them see beyond the initial integration. So you come in, you have your product, your platform, your service, whatever it is that you're selling, and how do you help them think further down the line? How do you help them think about blockchain from an open standard or from a co-collaboration standard? Help them think beyond the initial impact, and 5, 10 years down the line, how their organization might consider decentralized services in a way that they haven't thought of yet because it's too long term. So these are 2 more visionary questions that you might include in a presentation or in a conversation to enterprise when helping them think a little bit further down the road beyond immediate implementation. So that's kind of it on the enterprise requirement side. I think kind of a takeaway is always keeping in mind that enterprise have a lot of regulatory constrictions, privacy constrictions, data privacy constrictions that you have to take into consideration. So no matter how much most of us in the room are probably big proponents of decentralized services, there's generally only so much they can do. And so with that, this is a transition to the public and private kind of hybrid use case section and what we see some teams doing today. First, to my surprise, there's more enterprise interested in public blockchain than I realized. This does not add up to 100, obviously. So the surveyed people got to answer more than one answer. So again, to my surprise, there was more interest in public blockchains than I expected. Second, almost all respondents are interested in consortiums and will be joining one probably this year. This might not seem like a big deal, but it sort of is, because consortiums help keep costs down. It also helps with sharing of learning, and it also helps decrease risk. So even though we might think, like, who cares about consortium, in many ways it's kind of a big deal, specifically with things like Hyperledger, which again, most people in the room, if you've been around for a long time, might not think of it as like the best or most interesting thing to work with. However, it is Linux Foundation, it is Cisco, it is SAP, it is Daimler, it is Amex. There's so many organizations that are part of that consortium that it's kind of a big deal. And they're also they're doing some cool things, right? So Hyperledger Besu's and a more recent one that Ethereum Classic Co-op has joined as a Java-based Ethereum client. Hyperledger Sawtooth and Burrow are also kind of interesting as their EVM-based solutions, so that's kind of interesting. Enterprise Ethereum Alliance has also been doing a ton of work on the standardization for enterprise. This can be found on their website. It's probably old news for most of you in the room, but it's still pretty interesting, with the green sections being the public Ethereum aspect and the purple being the enterprise side. So showing kind of the public-private hybrid solution. There are 3 use cases that I'm going to share from some of our portfolio companies that are all using public-private solutions right now. So Statwig is the first one. There's a bunch of different work that they've been doing. I'm going to show or talk about 2 of their use cases. The most recent is a vaccine, or they're working with pharmaceutical industry in India, helping get vaccines to children and documenting that pathway. To my surprise, a quarter of children don't get vaccines because they're spoiled before they get to them. So this is kind of a big problem that they're solving for. And that the most expensive aspect of this problem is just the delivery alone, not the vaccine itself. So what they've been able to do and what they're solving for is they're tracking vaccine inventory and its temperature at different points along the cycle. And they're using blockchain specifically to manufacture batch details, timestamps of change of custody. They're also doing the cold chain asset literally from refrigerators of that release data. This is what it looks like for the private dashboard. And this is the public app, which they're calling their vaccine ledger. This has both private and public applications. The public aspect is anything that, say, the World Health Organization is going to have access to, or NGOs in general. What stays private is everything that's between the manufacturer and the distributor. So this is one example that's using both. They're also in the middle of a project right now with the government in India, tracking rice bags, rice that's essentially given to the most vulnerable populations in India. It's about 1 million+ people, and tracking the rice from farm to hand. The second use case is Whiteblock, who have used Hyperledger Sawtooth for this implementation. I think this is particularly interesting to enterprise because what they do is they have a test network or a simulation environment for enterprise to kind of see what their product or POC would look like in practice. They have a couple of different use cases so far, 2 different customers that I can speak about without giving the name. One, some of the name, is the Department of Veteran Affairs in the United States in digitizing medical records so that the veterans can have access to those records and do with it what they will. When the VA is looking at different proof of concepts, they can then run them in that test environment using the Whiteblock solution. A second example is fairly similar, but it's with identity management. This is not going to cover it, it's just going to show you what Whiteblock does because I don't have images from this. But the second one is with identity management and a Fortune 500 company doing the same thing, where the Fortune 500 is looking at multiple POCs, and instead of going out and building all of them, they're using Whiteblock to test those solutions. And the third one is Second State. Second State is a WebAssembly team. They're a badass compiler team based in Austin, Texas, and Taipei. They do a number of things, but most importantly, what they do for enterprise, it's the second bullet point up there, they have permission blockchains that support open source software to power search engines behind a firewall. What they're doing right now for a public-private kind of mix is in China. Depending on what your stance is on like government and authority, they are working with regional governments to have a public blockchain that different government organizations can participate in and run nodes. So public university, public hospital, public government organization will be those node hosts, providing public records to anyone who wants to get access to those. So I think that's fairly interesting from a public-private perspective, kind of like a Ripple consortium-like approach. And the last section is on adoption, and this is the interoperability piece that I had mentioned before. So what we believe on our team is that making tooling super simple is the way that we're going to increase adoption, and that's what we think interoperability is trying to achieve. It's trying to achieve access to more features, access to really making this make sense to the everyday developer. And so we don't know in the short term that having blockchains interoperate amongst each other, although we are supporting it with things like optimistic roll-ups, right? We do think that that's important, but what we think is going to really make a change in the short term is tooling. So I'm only going to go over one of these tools. It's our Jade service runner. It's called Jade for short. The rest of those, there's really not enough time to go through all four, but I'll give links to them at the end. So what is Jade? Jade is the idea of trying to get users to run their own decentralized services, which right now tends to be too difficult. So it creates a major barrier of entry for most people. And so the idea of Jade is it's just a point and click. It allows a developer and a user to connect to a blockchain pretty easily. And the idea is to move from the centralized service to the decentralized service. And it's an interoperable tool because it provides discovery for JSON RPC services. So it doesn't even need to be for blockchain per se. Because of that, we think it's going to help mainstream developers get into this space a lot easier than having to learn things like Web3 lingo. So today, if you're a developer, you have to write 26 combined different arguments to start a network, over and across parity, Geth, multi-Geth, now known as core Geth. But what if you could just launch it with the hit of a button? And so that's pretty much what it looks like now. Pretty simple, and I'll share the link again at the end so you can take a deeper dive. So Jade and Jade Desktop both exist today. It runs multi-Geth. It could run BTC if you wanted. It's an interoperable tool because, again, it runs JSON RPC discovery. It gives you clickables, and you can see how to start it pretty easily. Here in this image, the dApp on the left is using Jade in the middle, and it proxies request of the underlying service. And classic Geth and parity, Jade provides an interface to make easy installation daemonization. So the process is always running or alive, and an access to location and discovery to what the individual user is running. In the future, it would look a bit like this. So to kind of summarize, Jade allows for programmatically discoverable APIs, single-click installation, and fire and forget service daemonization. For the next steps for our team, we're working on a number of these different aspects and would love feedback for folks to test it out. And it includes everything from permissions to peering, abstract service definitions, decentralized service registry. If you do want to check this out further, the links are on the screen above. There's also a full walkthrough on YouTube that was performed at the EthCC Summit back in October. And to see the rest of the tools like OpenRPC, which is just like OpenAPI, or Signatory, which is pretty much like a signer, an offline signer, or expedition.org, which is a block explorer solution. You can see all of those right here. And there's a bunch of other projects on there as well. I think the big takeaway, again, is that for us, the interoperable aspect here is the tooling side, is that building tools that any developer can use, be it those who are already in the decentralized blockchain world or not, is going to be the way to increase adoption than trying to kind of have this back and forth over which blockchain should you use and when. We do think that tooling is the way to go. Finally, I'm on Twitter and Telegram. Email is always available as well, and feel free to reach out. Thank you.